This is the story of the American Revolution and how independence happened almost by accident. In the autumn of 1763, in a narrow office in London, a clerk sat copying out a number. It was not a dramatic number. It was not written in red ink or underlined or accompanied by any warning. It was simply the figure representing the national debt of Great Britain, and the clerk had almost certainly copied out similar figures many times before. But this one was different in a way he could not have known. Britain had just won the greatest war in its history. The 7 Years' War had ended in a victory so complete that it rearranged the map of the world. France had surrendered nearly all of its North American empire, 3 million square miles, an area comparable to the whole of Europe. There were men alive that year who believed they were watching the beginning of a golden age. And yet the number the clerk was copying had roughly doubled in 7 years. The interest alone, not the debt, only the interest, now consumed more than half of everything the British government spent in a year. Here is the first question worth sitting with tonight. And it's a strange one. How does a number in a ledger end up costing an empire a continent? Not through invasion, not through any single decision anyone could point to afterward and say, there, that was the moment, but slowly, across 20 years, through paperwork and misunderstanding and a series of choices that each seemed reasonable to the person making them. We don't know exactly when the outcome became unavoidable. Historians have argued about it for 2 centuries and have not settled it. Some point to 1765 and a tax on paper. Some point to 1770 and 5 men killed on a street in Boston. Some argue the real cause was simply distance. That an ocean 3,000 miles wide had been quietly doing its work for 150 years, and the tax was only the moment everyone noticed. Tonight we're going to follow the whole thing, 20 years, from a ledger in London to a field in Virginia, where a British army marched out and laid down its weapons while its own musicians played. Not the version with marble statues and clean paintings, the other version, the one where nobody knows what's coming, where reasonable people make defensible decisions that turn out badly, where the men who started the argument had no intention of ending an empire, and where the outcome we now treat as inevitable looked at nearly every stage like something that might still be avoided. And underneath all of it, one question that never quite gets answered. Who governs a place, really? The authority that holds the legal right, or the people who have simply been doing it, day after ordinary day, for so long that the habit has become a fact? Settle in. The ink is drying, and nobody in that office has any idea what they've just set in motion. To understand why Britain reached for the colonies' money, you have to understand what winning had cost. Armies must be paid, and ships must be built, and both had been paid for with borrowed money. By 1763, the government was in a position familiar to anyone who has ever won something expensive, triumphant and quietly terrified of the bill. And the bill was not finished arriving. The new territory needed defending. France had lost its colonies, but had not stopped being France. And there were men in Paris who would spend the next decade thinking about very little else. And the vast interior was not, whatever the maps in London suggested, empty. That last point deserves more attention than it usually gets. In 1763, native nations across the Great Lakes and Ohio country, many of them former French allies, now facing a British administration that offered less diplomacy and more assumption, mounted a coordinated resistance associated with an Ottawa leader remembered as Pontiac. Within months, nearly every British post west of the Appalachians was under attack. London drew a lesson. This territory would require a permanent garrison indefinitely, 3,000 miles from the Treasury, paying for it. So in October 1763, the Crown drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and declared that colonial settlement would not cross it. From London, this was sound administration. Fewer clashes meant fewer soldiers, meant less expense. It was, in its way, an attempt at peace. Now consider the same document from a farmhouse in Virginia. Land to the west was not an abstraction. It was what your children would have when your own fields had been divided too many times. Speculators had invested in claims beyond the mountains. Veterans had been promised western land as payment for service. Farming families had been moving west for generations because that was what you did when the soil in your valley grew tired. And now men who had never seen the Appalachians declared that the movement would stop. Notice this pattern because it will repeat for 20 years and explains more than any villain could. Almost nothing in this story was done out of malice. The proclamation was an attempt to prevent a war. It landed in America as an insult because its authors had made a small and entirely understandable mistake. They assumed a decision that made sense in London would make sense everywhere. That assumption was about to be tested repeatedly, and it would fail every time. By 1763, the 13 mainland colonies held more than 2 million people, growing at a rate that startled visitors. But they were not a nation and did not think of themselves as one. Massachusetts had been founded by Puritans, Maryland as a refuge for Catholics, Pennsylvania by Quakers. Each had its own charter, assembly, courts, and quarrels. A Bostonian arriving in Charleston would have found the accent difficult and the social rules unfamiliar, and underneath all of it ran a division deeper than any of these. Slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. In New England, enslaved people were perhaps 5% of the population. In Virginia, roughly 4 in 10. In South Carolina, closer to 6 in 10. This is not a detail to mention once and set aside, because it returns at nearly every stage of what follows. The colonies about to begin arguing, in the most eloquent language available, about liberty and consent and the tyranny of being governed without agreement, were societies built substantially on people who had none of those things. The contradiction was not invisible at the time. It was noticed, remarked upon, and mostly set aside. And the ways in which it was set aside will shape the entire war. What visitors noticed in these years was something harder to define. Travellers kept describing a quality they found either invigorating or faintly offensive, depending on temperament. People were less deferential. They asked what you did rather than who your family was. There is a phrase for the policy that produced this: salutary neglect. For decades, London had largely left the mainland colonies alone. Trade laws existed on paper and were enforced inconsistently. Governors were appointed and frequently outmaneuvered by assemblies who controlled their salaries. The profitable business of empire happened in the Caribbean and India, and the mainland was left to manage itself because nobody had a compelling reason to stop it. For 150 years, that was the arrangement. Not a written policy, just a habit. And here the story becomes genuinely strange. If you had asked a colonist in 1763 Whether he wanted independence, he would have been baffled and possibly offended. Colonists in this period were often intensely proud of being British. They understood their own liberties as British liberties, protections they possessed precisely because they were subjects of the Crown. But at the same time, and without anyone deciding it, they had spent a century and a half governing themselves in every practical sense. When a decision needed making on a Tuesday, it was made on a Tuesday by whoever was there, because the alternative was writing to London and waiting 4 months for a reply. 4 months. 2 for a letter to cross, 2 for the answer to return. Think about what that does to a relationship over 150 years. An entire way of life had been built around the assumption that London was too far away to consult. The habit of self-government had grown the way a tree grows through a fence, not defiantly, just steadily, because nothing was stopping it. Nobody in Britain thought of it that way. From London, the colonies were possessions, valuable, occasionally troublesome, unambiguously subordinate. There was no contradiction to resolve, because the question had never been asked, and that is the situation the debt walked into. Because to a minister looking at his ledgers, one fact seemed both obvious and unfair. Subjects at home were paying a great deal of tax, and subjects in America almost none. One calculation put it at 26 shillings a year against roughly 1. 26 to 1. Read that ratio and you can feel how reasonable the coming decision must have seemed. The colonies had been defended at extraordinary expense in a war that removed the French threat from their borders permanently. Why should they not contribute? That argument was not absurd. It was not the reasoning of tyrants. But the colonists were not going to argue about the amount. They were going to argue about something else. Something London did not see coming, did not understand when it arrived, and never fully accepted, even after 20 years of being told. It would take a tax on paper to bring it into the open. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. Certain documents would now require a stamp purchased from a government agent to be legally valid. Newspapers, pamphlets, contracts, ships' papers, land grants, attorneys' licenses, playing cards. Prime Minister George Grenville expected grumbling. His reasoning was sound. Englishmen at home had paid stamp duties for 70 years without incident. This was not an exotic imposition. It was an ordinary British tax extended to British subjects who happened to live elsewhere. The reaction was not grumbling, it was uproar, sustained and organised far beyond anything London had anticipated. So why this one? The amounts were small. Most colonists would pay a few shillings a year. The first answer is almost embarrassingly practical. Look again at the list of tax documents: newspapers, pamphlets, contracts, attorneys' licenses, ships' papers. Grenville had, without meaning to, designed a tax that fell with unusual precision on merchants, lawyers, and printers, the people who moved goods, the people who argued for a living, and the people who owned printing presses. If you set out to select from an entire society the small group best equipped to organise sustained opposition and communicate it to everyone else, you could hardly have chosen better on purpose. Within weeks, the colonial newspapers were full of it. Pamphlets appeared and were reprinted from Massachusetts to Georgia. One widely circulated protest warned the tax would drain the colonies of currency, freeze trade, and reduce free men to a condition the writer called slavery. That word is worth pausing on, and we'll return to it. Colonial writers used it constantly to describe their own political condition, being governed by a power they had not consented to, while living in societies where hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved in the most literal sense. Some noticed, most did not. Contemporaries pointed it out at the time and were mostly ignored, but the actual objection was more specific than most people remember. The colonists were not primarily arguing the tax was too large. They argued it was not properly a tax at all, because a tax, in the English constitutional tradition they claimed as their inheritance, was something a people granted through their own representatives. They had no representatives in Parliament, and never had. Therefore, Parliament could regulate their trade and govern their empire, but could not reach into their pockets. Because taxation without consent was not taxation, it was seizure. No taxation without representation. It has been repeated so often it has worn smooth, like a coin too long in circulation. But when it first appeared, it was a precise legal claim, made not by rebels, but by loyal subjects, insisting on rates they believed the Constitution already guaranteed them. They were not asking to leave the empire. They were asking to be treated as though they were fully inside it. Grenville's answer was a doctrine called virtual representation, and it is one of the most instructive arguments in the story, because he believed it, and because on its own terms it was not obviously wrong. Members of Parliament, he argued, represented the interests of the whole empire, not merely their own voters. An American was represented in the same general way most Britons were. Because, and this is the part usually left out, most Britons could not vote either. Some large cities returned no members at all. Some nearly empty patches of countryside returned two. If you insisted only directly elected representatives could tax, you were not merely making a point about America. You were pulling a thread that ran through the whole structure of British government. Grenville understood this. So did his opponents. When the argument reached Parliament, it was taken up by William Pitt, the statesman who had directed the recent war and was widely credited with winning it. Pitt took virtual representation apart. By whom exactly is an American represented here? By which member, for which county, for which borough, that its own members had perhaps never visited? He called the arrangement the rotten part of the Constitution, and predicted flatly it could not survive another century. Then he said the thing that made the government's position genuinely difficult, that this kingdom had no right to lay a tax upon the colonies. Pitt did not win. The act passed, but colonists read the debates, and what they read told them something important. Their argument had serious defenders in the heart of the empire itself. Meanwhile, the resistance was moving faster than London could track. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry proposed resolutions asserting that the settlers had brought with them all the rights of people born in Britain. The Assembly adopted them, but struck out his most radical claim that only Virginia's own Assembly could tax Virginians. Loyalty to the Crown ran deep, and serious men in that room found his language alarming. Watching from the visitors' area was a 22-year-old law clerk with an unusual capacity for absorbing arguments and filing them away. Thomas Jefferson would take Henry's rejected resolution to its logical conclusion 11 years later. In the streets, something less orderly was happening. Stamp distributors, men who had accepted an appointment without any sense it would be controversial, found themselves confronted by crowds. Property was destroyed. Effigies hung from trees that acquired names, liberty trees, permanent sites for a new kind of political theatre. Nearly every distributor in the colonies resigned before the act took effect. Be clear-eyed about this. Some of these crowds were frightening, and some of what they did was straightforwardly criminal. The men who organised them were not always the men writing the elegant constitutional pamphlets, and the relationship between the two was uneasy from the start. But the practical effect was decisive. By the time the act was to take force, there was almost nobody left willing to enforce it. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York, the first time that many had assembled over a shared problem. They petitioned the king carefully, even deferentially. And colonial merchants organised something more effective than any petition, a coordinated boycott of British goods. That was what actually worked. Within months, the pressure on Parliament was coming not from Boston, but from Bristol and Manchester, from British businessmen whose American customers had stopped buying. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Bells were rung. Toasts were drunk to the King's health, sincerely and at length. But on the very same day, Parliament passed something else. The Declaratory Act made no financial demand at all. It simply stated that Parliament had, and had always had, and by right ought to have, full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Read that last phrase slowly, because everything that follows lives inside it. In all cases whatsoever. Parliament had given up the tax and conceded nothing. It had said, in effect, we will not do this today, but you have no standing to tell us we cannot. The bells rang anyway. Trade resumed. For about a year, the Atlantic was calm. Then in 1767, a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, concluded that the problem was not the principle of colonial taxation. Grenville had simply chosen the wrong kind of tax. The colonists had objected to an internal levy, but everyone accepted Parliament could regulate imperial trade. So, place duties on goods arriving in colonial ports, and the objection evaporates. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, lead, paint, paper and tea, and specified that some revenue would pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in America. That second part was the sharpest edge. Colonial assemblies had spent a century learning that the reliable way to influence a governor was to control his pay. A governor whose salary was voted each year by the local assembly was a governor who listened. Townshend's plan would cut that cord entirely. You can see the logic. You can also see, from this distance, exactly what was going to happen. The colonial response was faster than in 1765, because the machinery already existed. Boycotts resumed, and a Pennsylvania lawyer named John Dickinson published essays, written in the calm voice of an imaginary farmer, arguing that a tax was a tax, whatever it was called. If its purpose was revenue rather than regulation, the constitutional objection stood. Dickinson was a moderate. He wanted reconciliation and would later refuse to sign the Declaration of Independence. When your moderates are making that argument, you have a problem. By 1768, Boston had become difficult enough to govern that London sent soldiers. This changed the nature of the conflict in a way taxes never could. Regiments were quartered in the town itself, not in a fort on the harbour's edge, but among the houses, on the streets, permanently visible. Sit with what that meant daily. You wake and there are soldiers on your street. They are not foreign occupiers, they are British soldiers, and you are a British subject, and in principle, you are on the same side. But they are there because your neighbours cannot be trusted, and everyone knows it. The soldiers were badly paid and frequently bored, and many took part-time work on the docks, competing directly with local labourers for the same jobs. Add drink, long winter evenings, and young men on both sides with something to prove. For 18 months, Boston lived with friction that never quite became violence. Then, on the evening of the 5th of March, 1770, a dispute outside the custom house drew a crowd. The next 20 minutes have been argued over ever since, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know what happened. Sworn statements taken within days contradict each other in ways that cannot all be reconciled. What seems clear? A small detachment, badly outnumbered, were surrounded by a crowd that grew from dozens into hundreds. Things were thrown: snowballs, ice, oyster shells, stones. The soldiers had been ordered not to fire. The noise made orders nearly impossible to hear. Somebody was knocked down, and then, without any order anyone could later verify, shots were fired. 5 men were killed. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent. It became known almost immediately as the Boston Massacre. And here we arrive at something genuinely fascinating about how history gets made, because the word massacre was a choice. 5 deaths in a chaotic street confrontation was a grim night in an 18th century port town. What turned it into a defining event was what happened afterward: the pamphlets, the funeral processions, and above all, a single engraving. Paul Revere's print is not journalism. It is a composition. It shows a line of soldiers firing in disciplined unison on command into peaceable, unarmed civilians. Almost nothing about it matches the surviving testimony. It is also one of the most effective pieces of political imagery ever produced in English, and it was reproduced across the colonies until it became, for thousands of people who lived nowhere near Boston, simply what had happened. Which raises a question this whole story keeps circling. How much of what we call history is the event? And how much is the account of the event that travelled fastest? There is a coda, and it is the part most people never hear. The soldiers were tried for murder. Publicly, in a Massachusetts court, before a Massachusetts jury, in a town that had just buried the dead. And their defence attorney was John Adams, a patriot, cousin of Samuel Adams, who had written extensively against Parliament's authority. He took the case on the grounds that men accused of a crime were entitled to a defence, and that a town denying them one would deserve none of the liberties it was claiming. He won. Most were acquitted. 2 were convicted of the lesser charge. The trial had an effect nobody in London could have engineered. It made things calmer. The troops were withdrawn from the town. The courts had visibly functioned. And a new Prime Minister, Lord North, looked at the damage the boycotts were doing to British commerce and repealed the Townshend duties, all of them but one. The tax on tea remained, 3 pence per pound, kept for a reason everyone understood. Repealing everything would have looked like surrender on the principle. One small duty kept the Declaratory Act alive in practice as well as theory, a token, a marker left on the board. For 3 years, the colonies were quiet. New England lived by shipping, and British trade law was, for a Massachusetts merchant, a permanent low-grade irritation, a system of regulations designed to ensure colonial commerce enriched Britain. In practice, merchants had spent generations working around it. Molasses arrived from the French Caribbean without troubling the customs house. Cargoes were declared imaginatively. Smuggling was not the work of a criminal underworld. It was ordinary commercial practice conducted by respectable men who sat in the front pews on Sunday. John Hancock, the wealthiest merchant in Boston and a principal financier of the Patriot movement, was among the most successful practitioners. So when Britain began enforcing seriously after 1763, it was not experienced as the correction of a crime. It was experienced as a hostile change to the way business had always been done. Warships stopped and searched colonial vessels. Ships were seized, and suspected smugglers began to be tried in vice-admiralty courts. Here is why that mattered enormously. A vice-admiralty court had no jury. A single Crown-appointed judge heard the case and decided it. From London, this was simply practical. A Boston jury would never convict a Boston merchant. And everybody knew it. But from the colonial side, this was the removal of one of the oldest protections in English law. Trial by jury was not a technicality. It was among the fundamental securities of a free people. A policy adopted for administrative convenience handed the Patriot movement its most powerful argument, that Parliament was not merely taxing them without consent, but stripping away the protections that made them Englishmen at all. Meanwhile, in London, an unrelated crisis was building. The East India Company was the largest corporation in the world, holding a monopoly on trade with India and the East, governing territory, maintaining armies. By 1772, it was approaching bankruptcy, with warehouses full of unsold tea, and it was too entangled with British finance to be allowed to fail. So in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. Read carefully, it is not what most people assume. It did not raise the tax. The 3-penny duty stayed exactly where it had been. What it did was let the company ship directly to America, cutting out middlemen with exemptions that made its tea cheaper than it had ever been. Cheaper, in fact, than smuggled Dutch tea. Pause there, because this is where it becomes interesting. Parliament had produced a measure that made a popular product less expensive. On the surface, a gift. But look at who it damaged. Colonial merchants who had built businesses importing tea were about to be undercut by a state-backed monopoly. And beyond the commercial injury lay a principle Patriot writers seized on immediately. If you accept cheap taxed tea because it is cheap, you have accepted the tax. You have conceded, for the price of a bargain, that Parliament may tax you at will. The cheapness was the trap. That was precisely the argument. 7 company ships crossed the Atlantic with roughly 250 tons of tea and sailed into ports where committees had already organised to keep the cargo off the docks. In Philadelphia, the ship turned back. In New York, the same. In Charleston, the tea was landed and locked in a warehouse where it sat rotting. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson decided he had had enough. Hutchinson was Massachusetts-born, deeply learned, genuinely devoted to the colony, and thoroughly exhausted by a decade of being defied. He also had 2 sons who were consignees for the tea, which did not help his judgment. He determined the ships would enter the harbour, and the cargo would be landed lawfully. Under customs regulations, a ship that had entered had 20 days to unload and pay duty. After that, officials could seize the cargo and land it by force. The clock ran out on the 16th of December, 1773. That evening, a mass meeting waited for word that the governor had relented. The word came back that he had not, and then perhaps 150 men went down to Griffin's Wharf. They were dressed loosely and unconvincingly as Mohawk men. Almost nobody was fooled, and the disguise was not meant to fool anyone. It was symbolic, a deliberate claim to a specifically American identity, distinct from the Britain they were defying. Whether they thought at all about the actual Mohawk nation is a question worth asking, and the answer is probably no. They boarded 3 ships, broke open 340 chests, and emptied them into the harbour. 90,000 pounds of tea, the equivalent today of something approaching $2 million. And here is the detail that always stops me. It took roughly 3 hours, and it was almost entirely orderly. No crew members were harmed, nothing else was damaged. A broken padlock was reportedly replaced afterward. One man caught pocketing tea for himself was stripped of it on the spot. Then they swept the decks and went home. This was not a riot. It was a demonstration, executed with a precision that suggests a great deal of thought about how it would be reported. In London, the reaction was fury, and it is worth understanding why, because it was not simply spite. From London, this was the destruction of an enormous quantity of private property in a British port by a mob in defiance of law. It came after a decade in which Parliament had repeatedly backed down, repealed the Stamp Act, repealed the Townshend duties, and been met each time with escalating defiance. The conclusion drawn was that leniency had failed, that every concession had been read as weakness, that British authority in North America now existed only on paper and would vanish entirely unless somebody demonstrated it was real. That conclusion was wrong, and it was the most consequential error anyone made in 20 years. But you can see how they reached it. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed a series of measures aimed at Massachusetts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts. In America, they were immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts, and the renaming was itself a small masterpiece of political communication. The harbour was closed to all commerce until the tea was paid for. Not reduced, closed in a town that lived entirely by the sea. The colony's charter was rewritten. The council, previously elected, would now be appointed by the Crown, and town meetings, the fundamental unit of New England life, were restricted to 1 a year without permission. Officials accused of crimes while suppressing riots could be tried in Britain, and a military governor arrived to enforce it all, General Thomas Gage, with 4,000 soldiers. The strategy was explicit: isolate Massachusetts, make an example severe enough that the other 12 colonies would look at the wreckage and quietly decide the argument was not worth having. It did precisely the opposite, almost immediately, because rewriting a colonial charter by Act of Parliament was a demonstration that any charter could be rewritten by Act of Parliament at any time, for any reason. Every assembly in America read that and understood they were looking at their own future. Food began moving toward blockaded Boston from hundreds of miles away. Grain from Virginia, livestock from Connecticut, became money raised in South Carolina. People who had never met a Bostonian sent what they could, because the principle had suddenly become general. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia and called it the Continental Congress. Most of them had never met. That is easy to skim past, and it is genuinely important. These men had lived in separate colonies with separate laws and assumptions. Many arrived expecting to dislike each other, and some did. They were also deeply divided about what they were even there to do. Dickinson of Pennsylvania wanted reconciliation. The Adamses arrived from an occupied colony with different priorities, and Patrick Henry held a position still shocking to most of the room: complete separation from Great Britain. They argued for 7 weeks and produced a compromise. A comprehensive boycott enforced by local committees, plus another petition to the king assuring him of their loyalty. The petition never received a formal answer, but something had happened at Carpenter's Hall that mattered more than the documents. 56 men from 12 colonies had discovered that they could work with each other. That discovery would matter enormously in 18 months, when the same body had to invent a government, an army, and a country, largely from nothing. Meanwhile, Gage was worrying about something practical: gunpowder. It could not be manufactured in useful quantities in America. It had to be imported and stored in magazines scattered across the colony. Whoever controlled those magazines controlled whether anyone could fight at all. In September 1774, he sent a detachment to secure a powder store near Boston. The operation was quick, bloodless, entirely successful. And then something happened that reveals more about Massachusetts that autumn than any document. Rumours spread. Within hours, the countryside was hearing that soldiers had killed civilians, that villages were burning, that warships were shelling Boston. None of it was true. Not one word. But thousands of armed men were on the roads before anyone could correct it. They dispersed the next day, embarrassed, once the truth caught up. Both sides drew conclusions from what became known as the powder alarm, and both were correct. Gage learned he was surrounded by a population that could put thousands of armed men in the field within a day. The militia learned the same thing about themselves. Gage wrote to London something his superiors did not want to read: that suppressing Massachusetts would require a far larger army than anyone in Britain was contemplating, and that the colony was already, in practical terms, beyond his control. In February 1775, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in rebellion. In March, Patrick Henry told the Virginia Convention that the war had already begun, and that for himself, he would take liberty or death. Virginia voted to arm its militia. In April, Gage received orders to disarm the Massachusetts militia and arrest its leaders. He chose a limited objective. Military stores were reported at Concord, 20 miles away. He would send a column at night, seize them, and be back before the countryside could react. It was a reasonable plan. It depended entirely on surprise. Around midnight on the 19th of April, 700 British soldiers were rowed quietly across the harbour and began marching west. By the time the first man stepped ashore, riders were already ahead of them. Boston was a town of 15,000 on a peninsula, and it was nearly impossible to move 700 men through it unnoticed. Stable hands saw horses prepared, dock workers saw boats gathered, and the Patriots had spent months building exactly the network that turns small observations into a warning. Several riders went out. Paul Revere is the one everyone remembers, largely because of a poem written 85 years later that got most of the details wrong. There were others, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, the only one of the three to reach Concord. Revere himself was detained by a patrol partway through the night. The system worked anyway, and that is the point. It was not built around any one rider. Each village warned the next. In Lexington, a militia captain named John Parker gathered about 80 men on the village green. Parker was in his mid-40s, a veteran, and dying of tuberculosis. He would not live out the year. What he intended is not entirely clear, and it matters. 80 men could not have stopped 700 regulars, and everyone knew it. The likeliest explanation is that he meant to make a visible statement, to stand in the open as free subjects, be seen, and let the column pass. They waited in the dark for hours. At one point, with no sign of the British, most went into the tavern to keep warm. At about 5 a.m, the head of the column came into view. The two sides faced each other across the green in grey light. Officers rode forward and ordered the militia to disperse. There was shouting. Parker, by most accounts, told his men to disperse, and some had begun to. And then a shot was fired. Nobody knows who fired it. This is not a case where one theory is probably right. The evidence genuinely does not resolve it. Men on both sides swore statements within days, and they contradict each other completely. What we know is what followed. The regulars fired, the militia scattered, 8 Americans were killed, 1 British soldier was wounded. The whole encounter lasted a few minutes. Hold that in your mind. 8 men on a village green before sunrise in a confrontation nobody had planned, beginning with a shot nobody can identify. That was the start of the American Revolutionary War. Notice how ordinary the beginnings of enormous things tend to be, and how rarely anyone present understands what they are standing inside. The column marched onto Concord and found very little. The town had moved or hidden its stores days earlier. North of the town, several hundred militia gathered on a hill and watched smoke rise from the buildings the soldiers had set alight, not knowing what was burning. Around mid-morning, they advanced on the North Bridge, held by a much smaller detachment. Both sides had orders not to fire first. Both were nervous. Shots were exchanged, men fell on each side, and the outnumbered soldiers withdrew. Colonel Smith understood his situation immediately. He was 20 miles from Boston, with the countryside filling up with armed men. Around noon, he ordered the march back. What followed was the longest afternoon in the British Army's American service. The road ran between stone walls and orchards, and by early afternoon, thousands of militiamen were arriving along its length. They did not form ranks or offer battle in any way an 18th century officer would have recognised. They fired from behind cover, moved and fired again. At Lexington, a relief brigade of 1,000 men with 2 field guns met the exhausted column and covered the remaining miles. They reached safety near Charlestown at nightfall. 73 British dead, 173 wounded. 49 Americans killed, 39 wounded. By the standards of European warfare, these were minor engagements. But Lord Percy, who commanded the relief brigade, wrote something afterward that deserves attention. The assessment of a professional with no reason to flatter his opponents. Anyone who imagined these men an irregular mob, he observed, was thoroughly mistaken. There were men among them who knew exactly what they were doing. He was right, and London would spend 6 years learning it. Within days, roughly 15,000 New England militiamen had converged on the neck of land connecting Boston to the mainland. The British Army in North America was under siege in the town it had been sent to control. 3 weeks after Lexington, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. The delegates had expected to coordinate boycotts. They arrived to find a war. What happened next is one of the more remarkable improvisations in political history, and it happened without anyone having the authority to do any of it. Congress was not a government. It had no legal existence, no power to tax, no constitution, and over the following weeks it began appointing committees to procure supplies, authorizing loans, issuing paper currency, and opening communications with potential allies. They were inventing a state while insisting they were merely petitioning a king. But the most urgent problem was the army. 15,000 men were sitting outside Boston, organized by colony, commanded by officers from their own towns, enlisted for short terms. They were not an army. They were 13 separate militias occupying the same hillsides. Somebody had to command them, and the choice was politically explosive. New England had the men. If New England also supplied the general, the war would look like a regional quarrel rather than a continental cause. John Adams, a Massachusetts man, rose and nominated a delegate from Virginia. George Washington was 43. He had commanded Virginia troops in the French and Indian War, where his early performance had been mixed and his personal courage never in question. He was a wealthy planter, made wealthier by marriage, and he possessed a physical presence people commented on constantly. 6'2" in an era when that was extraordinary. He had also come to Congress wearing his militia uniform, which was not subtle and was not meant to be. On the 15th of June, 1775, Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief. He declined a salary and asked only for expenses. His private letters that week complicate the marble statue. He wrote to his wife that he had done everything he could to avoid the appointment and feared it would prove beyond his abilities. This was not false modesty. He had commanded a few thousand men in his life. He was now expected to build a professional army from untrained contingents of 13 jealous colonies and use it against the most successful military power on earth. And before he could reach Boston, the fighting resumed without him. The militia had begun fortifying heights on the Charlestown Peninsula, ground from which artillery could threaten British ships. Gage decided he had to take them. There were other options. A landing behind the American position would have trapped the entire force. But there was also a mood in the British command that historians have noted uncomfortably ever since. A desire to demonstrate, after the humiliation of the Concord Road, what trained regulars could do. On the 17th of June, about 2,500 British troops assaulted Breed's Hill frontally. The Americans, behind earthworks, held fire until the lines were close and then delivered volleys at short range. The first assault failed, the second failed, the third succeeded largely because the defenders had run out of ammunition rather than because the position broke. The British took the hill and lost roughly 200 dead and more than 800 wounded, over 1,000 casualties in an afternoon, from a force of 2,500. American losses were around 450, among them Joseph Warren, the Boston physician who had been central to the entire movement and who chose to fight in the ranks as an ordinary soldier. The battle is remembered as Bunker Hill, after the neighbouring high ground, a small historical accident that has proved permanent, technically a British victory. Nobody on either side treated it as one. General Henry Clinton wrote with grim precision that a few more such victories would shortly have ended British rule in America. Washington arrived on the 2nd of July and found something worse than he had feared. The camp was a sprawl with no coherent layout. Discipline was, by his standards, non-existent. Officers socialised with their men as equals, and soldiers came and went as they pleased. There were few uniforms and fewer cannon, and there was almost no gunpowder. One estimate suggested enough for each man to fire 9 rounds. 9 rounds for an entire army facing regulars. He kept that figure secret for months, because if the British had known it, they could have walked out of Boston at any time. What he did over the following weeks shows why Congress had chosen well. Badges and sashes to distinguish officers from men. A small thing that changes how an army behaves. Serious punishments for desertion and fighting. A reorganised camp. And one decision that may have saved the war. Smallpox had broken out across Massachusetts. Washington ordered his men inoculated. A risky, unpleasant procedure that deliberately induced a mild case to confer immunity, controversial enough that several colonies had banned it. British troops were largely immune, having grown up where the disease was endemic. His were not. An army encamped for months in unsanitary conditions was exactly the environment where smallpox destroys a fighting force. It was among the least dramatic decisions of the war, and possibly one of the most important. Then a 25-year-old former bookseller solved a problem everyone had declared impossible. Henry Knox had run a shop in Boston and had no formal military training. What he had was an obsessive habit of reading military treatises behind the counter, and a conviction that the 59 heavy guns sitting unused at Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles away, some weighing more than 2 tons, could be brought to Boston. Between them lay mountains, forests, and frozen rivers. He proposed to move them anyway, in winter, using sleds and oxen. It took about 10 weeks. He lost guns through the ice and hauled them back out. In late January 1776, he arrived with all 59, at which point Washington put him in command of the entire artillery arm, a bookseller running the guns of a national army. The plan was to fortify Dorchester Heights, from which those guns could threaten the fleet at anchor. The problem was that fortifying a hill takes days, and the British would see it happening. So everything was prepared in advance. Timber, stone, prefabricated earthworks, while a nightly bombardment masked the noise. On the 3rd night, under cover of the guns, the Americans hauled 20 cannon onto the heights and dug in. At dawn, the British looked up at a fortified position that had not existed the previous evening. Howe prepared an assault. A storm made it impossible. Short of food, with his ships now threatened, he arranged to evacuate unopposed in exchange for not burning the town. On the 20th of March, 1776, the British sailed for Halifax. After 11 months, the siege was over, and Washington, who had won it without fighting a battle, had his first victory. While Boston was being celebrated, something in Virginia was exposing the central contradiction of the American cause more sharply than any pamphlet. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, had been driven from Williamsburg and taken refuge aboard Royal Navy ships. From there, in November 1775, he issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved men belonging to rebel masters who would leave their plantations and take up arms for the king. Be precise about what this was. Dunmore was not an abolitionist. He owned enslaved people himself. The offer excluded those held by loyalists. It was a military measure aimed at breaking the rebellion in a colony where 4 in 10 people were enslaved. And it worked, in the sense that mattered to the people it was addressed to. Within a month, several hundred men had reached his lines. Over the course of the war, tens of thousands of enslaved people across the colonies would seek freedom behind British lines, undertaken not by governments but by individuals walking away in the dark at enormous personal risk. The Patriot reaction was immediate and, from any distance at all, extraordinary. Men who had spent a decade writing about liberty denounced Dunmore's offer of freedom as a violation of law, justice, and humanity. Washington called him an arch-traitor to the rights of humanity. There is no way to soften this, and no reason to try. The revolution being made in the name of liberty had, at its southern heart, an economy of unfree labour, and its leaders understood perfectly well what Dunmore had done. He had aimed at the thing they could not defend and could not do without. The practical result was that the proclamation converted wavering southern landowners into committed enemies of the Crown. It may have been the most effective recruitment the Patriot cause ever received, and it came from a British governor. It is worth pausing on the Loyalists more generally, because they are the people most thoroughly written out of the story. Perhaps one colonist in 5 opposed the revolution. That is not a fringe, that is hundreds of thousands of people. Their reasons were varied and mostly serious. Some had family and commercial ties to Britain. Some were Anglicans for whom the king was head of their church. Many simply believed that 13 fractious colonies with no shared government would collapse into anarchy the moment British protection was withdrawn, and could point to a great deal of history supporting them. One loyalist writer asked whether it was truly better to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, or by 3,000 tyrants less than a mile from your door. Many more would have preferred to stay out entirely. That option was closing. Local committees had taken over the functions of government, and by 1776, anyone suspected of loyalist sympathies risked investigation, confiscation, or being driven from their home. The conflict divided congregations, towns, and families, and did so most bitterly in the places where the fighting was lightest. Which brings us to the pamphlet. In January 1776, an anonymous work appeared in Philadelphia called Common Sense. Its author was Thomas Paine, an English corset maker's son who had failed at nearly everything he attempted and arrived in America 2 years earlier with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. What Paine did was not to make a new argument. It was to change the language the argument was conducted in. Colonial political writing had been loyally, full of charters and precedents addressed to men who read Latin. Paine wrote in plain direct English that a farmer could read aloud in a tavern, and he attacked not Parliament, not the ministers, but monarchy itself. He ridiculed the idea that any family should rule by inheritance. He argued that an island could not permanently govern a continent, and he insisted that what was at stake was not a colonial grievance, but something with a claim on everyone. Roughly 100,000 copies circulated within months in a population of 2.5 million. For a decade, independence had been the private position of a small number of radicals. Within weeks, it was being discussed at every table in America. In June, Congress began debating it directly, and the debates were not comfortable. Congress had decided a step this large must be unanimous. 12 colonies for and 1 against would have been worse than nothing. Delegates were bound by instructions from home assemblies, some of which explicitly forbade voting for separation. Instructions had to be changed. Men had to be persuaded or absent themselves at the right moment. On the 2nd of July, 1776, Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, it adopted the written declaration, drafted principally by Jefferson and then revised by Congress, which cut roughly a quarter of his text. Among the passages removed was a lengthy denunciation of the slave trade, struck to secure Southern votes. The document opened by asserting as self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed with rights no government may take away, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 56 men eventually signed, pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honour. That was not rhetoric. Signing was treason, punishable by death, committed by men who put their names and addresses to it, while the largest expeditionary force in British history was already at sea. On the 29th of June, 1776, lookouts in New York saw ships on the horizon. 30, then 70, then more than 100. Over the following weeks, the count climbed to roughly 400 vessels, carrying 32,000 soldiers and 12,000 sailors. Close to half the military strength of the British Empire, assembled in one harbour for one purpose. Washington had about 20,000 men, most undertrained and badly equipped. Perhaps a quarter were sick or absent at any moment. The campaign that followed was militarily close to a disaster. At Long Island in late August, Howe found a lightly guarded pass, swung 10,000 men around the American flank, and rolled up the position from behind. Only a handful of units held together. The Maryland and Delaware battalions fought a rearguard action against overwhelming odds that bought the rest of the army time to escape. The Americans lost more than 2,000 men. The British lost around 400. What saved the Continental Army was 2 nights of luck and 1 night of extraordinary discipline. The wind stayed in a direction that prevented the fleet from cutting off the East River. Howe, wary of another Bunker Hill, chose to dig siege lines rather than assault. And under cover of darkness and a morning fog, Washington evacuated 9,000 men across the river to Manhattan without losing one, an operation conducted in near silence with muffled oars that professional soldiers have admired ever since. The rest of the autumn was a slow unravelling. New York was abandoned. At Kip's Bay, the American line dissolved so completely that Washington was seen trying to rally fleeing men and being ignored, and reportedly asked aloud whether these were the men with whom he was expected to defend America. Fort Washington fell in November with nearly 3,000 men taken prisoner, a loss the army could not afford, caused partly by Washington's own indecision. Then came the retreat across New Jersey. Fewer than 6,000 men moving west in worsening weather, hoping to gather volunteers and finding almost none. Howe offered pardons to anyone who would swear allegiance, and thousands accepted, including 2 former members of Congress and 1 signer of the Declaration. Sit with that. 5 months after signing, one of the men who had pledged his life and sacred honour took the king's pardon. By the 1st of December, more enlistments had expired and 2,000 more men simply left. Congress fled Philadelphia. Washington crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania with what remained, destroying every boat he could not take. He had perhaps 6,000 men. Most of their enlistments would expire on the 31st of December. In 3 weeks, he would have almost no army at all. And so, with essentially nothing left to preserve, he decided to attack. The plan was more complicated than it needed to be. 3 columns crossing the Delaware at 3 points on Christmas night, converging on the Hessian garrison at Trenton before dawn. 2 of the 3 columns failed to cross at all. The river was 300 yards wide, running fast and full of ice. Men, guns and horses were ferried across in flat-bottomed boats in a storm of sleet, guided by Pennsylvania boatmen who knew the water. Washington's column reached the far bank 3 hours behind schedule. Every reason to turn back was present. He went on, reasoning that in weather this bad, nobody would expect anything. The garrison was 1,400 Hessians, German soldiers hired by the Crown, professional and well regarded, under Colonel Rule, who had been warned and had concluded, after a minor skirmish on Christmas Day, that the danger had passed. The Americans arrived shortly after dawn, and it was over in under an hour. About 100 Hessians were killed or wounded, and roughly 900 captured. American losses were 5 wounded. A week later, with Cornwallis and 8,000 men advancing, Washington left campfires burning to suggest an army still in place, marched north through the night on frozen back roads, and struck the garrison at Princeton at first light. Another sharp, brief, successful action, at whose critical moment Washington rode directly into the fighting to steady his men. One officer described watching it as the most frightening thing he ever saw, because everything depended on that one man, and he was under fire like anybody else. Trenton and Princeton were small. In the arithmetic of European warfare, they barely register. But they arrived in the darkest week of the war and changed what people believed was possible. Men re-enlisted, militia turned out. New Jersey, which had been swearing loyalty oaths by the thousand in December, became hostile territory by February. And in the courts of Europe, professional observers who had been watching a rebellion collapse quietly revised their assessments. For 1777, the British devised a plan of real elegance. General Burgoyne would march south from Canada down the Hudson Valley. A second force would push east from Lake Ontario. Howe would come north from New York. The 3 would meet near Albany, and New England, the heart of the rebellion, would be severed from the rest of the continent by a line of British posts along the river. Cut off the head, and the body dies. It was a good plan. It failed for a reason so mundane that it is almost comic, and the reason tells you a great deal about how empires actually work. Howe did not go north. He had his own idea: to take Philadelphia, the rebel capital, and force Washington into a decisive battle. Whether his orders were unclear, or whether the letter approving Burgoyne's plan simply sat on a desk in London while the minister responsible left for a weekend in the country, is still debated. What is not debated is that in the summer of 1777, Howe put his army on ships and sailed south, away from Burgoyne, at exactly the moment Burgoyne needed him. Howe got his campaign. He beat Washington at Brandywine in September and occupied Philadelphia. Congress fled again. Washington counterattacked at Germantown in October in fog so thick that American units fired on each other and lost. By any conventional measure, the British had won the year. They held the enemy capital. It made no difference at all, and that is one of the strangest lessons of this war. Philadelphia was not London. Congress was a group of men who could meet anywhere, and did. Capturing it accomplished nothing except to remove Howe's army from the place it was actually needed, because meanwhile Burgoyne was marching south into the woods. He had roughly 7,000 men and an unwieldy supply train, and he was moving into terrain that punished exactly that. The Americans felled trees across the roads, destroyed bridges, and dammed streams to flood the low ground. Burgoyne's army covered some stretches at barely a mile a day, and as it slowed, it began to gather enemies. A detachment sent to seize supplies at Bennington was destroyed by New England militia. Rumours of atrocities on the frontier, some true, some not, brought thousands of men out of farms across New York and New England who had shown no interest in the war until it arrived near their own valleys. By September, Burgoyne was deep in hostile country, his supply line back to Canada attenuating, with an American army under Horatio Gates entrenched on high ground at Saratoga, directly across his path. He attacked twice, in September and again in October. Both attacks were checked, largely by riflemen under Daniel Morgan and by an aggressive field commander who repeatedly threw himself into the fighting without any clear authority to do so. That commander was Benedict Arnold, and hold on to that name, because it is going to matter later in a way nobody watching him at Saratoga could have imagined. By mid-October, Burgoyne was surrounded, outnumbered roughly 3-1, and out of options. On the 17th of October, 1777, he surrendered his entire army. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms in the woods of upstate New York. Now, here is why this matters more than any other single event in the war. A packet ship carried the news to France. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin had been working for over a year, and he had been working under a specific difficulty. France wanted Britain humiliated. That was not in question. Louis XVI's ministers had never forgotten 1763. They had been quietly funneling money and gunpowder to the Americans through a front company almost from the beginning. But quiet assistance is one thing, and open war is another. France would not commit unless the Americans could demonstrate they might actually win, because backing a losing rebellion meant a war with Britain and nothing to show for it. Saratoga was the demonstration. In February 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States. Spain entered against Britain the following year. The Dutch Republic followed, and a conflict that had been a colonial rebellion became something Britain had spent a century dreading. A global war fought in the Caribbean, off the coast of India, in the Mediterranean, and eventually at Gibraltar. Consider what that did to British strategy. Before 1778, Britain could concentrate on America. After 1778, every ship sent to North America was a ship not defending the Sugar Islands, which were worth more to the Treasury than the 13 colonies had ever been. Every regiment sent to New York was a regiment not available if France attempted a landing in England itself. The war Britain was fighting in America suddenly became the least valuable of several wars it was fighting at once. Franklin, meanwhile, had become something remarkable in Paris. He was in his 70s, internationally famous as a scientist, and he understood theatre. He wore a plain brown coat and a fur cap in a court of powdered wigs, and let the French decide for themselves that he was a natural philosopher from the forests of the New World. His portrait appeared on snuff boxes and rings. He was, by some distance, the most effective diplomat of the century. The alliance he secured did not win the war by itself, but without French money, French gunpowder, French officers, and above all the French navy, it is very difficult to construct a version of events in which the Americans win at all. The turning point of the American Revolution happened in a forest in New York, and its consequences were decided in a palace outside Paris. While Franklin was winning France, Washington's army spent the winter of 1777 into 1778 encamped at Valley Forge, about 20 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia. The story of that winter has been told so often that it has acquired a kind of religious quality. Barefoot men in the snow, blood in their footprints, suffering nobly endured. Some of that is true. Roughly 2,000 men died there, almost all of disease rather than cold. Typhus, dysentery, influenza moving through crowded huts. But the detail that gets lost is that the suffering was not primarily caused by British action or by weather. It was caused by administration. There was food in Pennsylvania that winter. There were shoes and blankets in warehouses. What there was not was a functioning system to move them, because Congress had no power to tax. The currency it printed was collapsing in value. Farmers preferred to sell to the British, who paid in hard coin, and the supply department had been left in the hands of men who were variously incompetent, absent, or profiting personally. Washington's letters that winter are not soaring. They are the letters of an exasperated manager who cannot get anyone to do their job, and who understood that his army was more likely to dissolve from paperwork than from bayonets. And yet, something happened at Valley Forge that made the second half of the war possible. In February 1778, a Prussian officer arrived, sent by Franklin from Paris, carrying credentials that were substantially inflated. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben had been presented as a lieutenant general who had served on the staff of Frederick the Great. He had in fact been a captain. He spoke no English. He was also exactly what the army needed. Steuben understood something the Continental Army had never had time to learn, that what separates soldiers from armed men is not courage, but drill. The ability to move from column into line quickly, to load and fire in ranks without confusion, to camp without the camp becoming a source of disease. He wrote a training manual in French, had it translated a chapter at a time, and personally drilled a model company which then trained others. He swore magnificently in 3 languages, none of them English, and his interpreter's job included translating the profanity, which the soldiers found delightful. By spring, the army that emerged from Valley Forge could manoeuvre. It was not the same instrument that had been chased across New Jersey. The test came in June 1778. With France in the war, the British abandoned Philadelphia and marched overland to New York, and Washington caught them at Monmouth Courthouse on a day of ferocious heat. The battle itself was inconclusive. The British extracted themselves and continued to New York. But something had been demonstrated. Continental regiments stood in the open field against British regulars, absorbed attacks, counterattacked, and held. Nobody ran. For the next 3 years in the North, the war settled into something closer to a stalemate. The British held New York. Washington watched it. Neither could destroy the other. And in that long, uneventful middle, the war produced its most famous act of betrayal. Benedict Arnold had been, by a wide margin, the most aggressive and successful field commander the Americans possessed. He had marched an army through the Maine wilderness to attack Quebec. He had improvised a fleet on Lake Champlain that delayed a British advance by a year. At Saratoga, He had been central to the fighting and had been badly wounded in the leg for the second time. He had also been passed over for promotion repeatedly, accused of financial irregularities, investigated by Congress, and left to fund some of his own operations out of his pocket. He was proud, thin-skinned, badly in debt, and married to a woman from a prominent Loyalist family in Philadelphia. In 1780, commanding the fortress at West Point on the Hudson, he agreed to hand it to the British. The plot failed almost by accident. The British officer carrying the plans, Major John Andre, was stopped by militiamen who did not quite believe his papers. Arnold received word minutes before he would have been arrested and escaped downriver to a British warship. Andre was tried and hanged and was mourned by both sides. He had been widely liked. Arnold received a British commission and a substantial sum of money, and has spent the rest of his life in a kind of exile, distrusted by the country he had betrayed and never quite accepted by the one he joined. The name stuck to him so completely that in American English it stopped being a name at all and became a word meaning traitor. But the interesting question is not why Arnold betrayed the cause. Plenty of men changed sides in this war, in both directions, for reasons ranging from conviction to convenience. The interesting question is what it says about how close the whole enterprise ran to failure. That in 1780, the most capable general in the American army looked at Congress, at the worthless currency, at the unpaid troops and the political infighting, and made a rational calculation that this side was going to lose. He was wrong, but he was not obviously wrong at the time. By 1779, Britain had changed strategy entirely. The Northern Campaign had produced no decisive result in 4 years, so the government turned to a theory it had held since the beginning, that the southern colonies were full of loyalists, bullied into silence by a violent minority who would rise in support if the king's army gave them protection. There was some truth in it. There were substantial loyalist populations in the Carolinas and Georgia. The theory's error was in imagining they could be organised, protected, and left in control once the regular army moved on. The campaign began well. Savannah fell in 1778. In May 1780, Charleston surrendered after a siege, and with it an entire American army of roughly 5,000 men, the worst single American defeat of the war. In August, Cornwallis destroyed a second army under Horatio Gates at Camden, where Gates fled the field so quickly and so far that his career ended on the spot. Within a few months, organised American resistance in the Deep South had essentially ceased to exist, and then the strategy began consuming itself. Because the war in the Carolinas was not primarily a war between armies, it was a civil war between neighbours, and it was fought with a bitterness that appalled the professional officers of both sides. Loyalist militia and patriot militia burned each other's farms, executed prisoners, and settled quarrels that had nothing to do with Parliament. British commanders discovered they could occupy a town but not the countryside, and that every reprisal produced 10 new enemies. At King's Mountain, in October 1780, a loyalist force was destroyed by frontier militia who had come over the Appalachians specifically to fight it. Almost everyone engaged on both sides that day was American. Into this, Washington sent the best general he had left. Nathanael Greene was a Rhode Island Quaker with a limp who had been effectively expelled from his meeting for military interest and who had educated himself in warfare out of books. He arrived to command an army that barely existed, a few thousand hungry men, no supplies, no money. What Greene did next is studied by soldiers to this day, because he understood something unusual about his own position. He could not defeat Cornwallis, so he decided to exhaust him instead. He divided his tiny force, which every principle of 18th century warfare said was suicidal against a superior enemy, and used the pieces to draw Cornwallis in two directions at once. One half, under Daniel Morgan, turned at a grazing ground called Cowpens in January 1781, and destroyed the British light troops sent after it in a battle that is often called the most tactically perfect American action of the war. Morgan arranged his militia in lines that were expected to fire twice and withdraw, so that the retreat everyone feared became part of the plan. Then Greene ran. He led Cornwallis on a punishing chase north across the Carolinas, over rivers he had scouted in advance, and crossed just ahead of pursuit. Cornwallis, desperate to catch him, burned his own supply wagons to move faster. When Greene finally turned and fought at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, he lost the field. Cornwallis held the ground at the end of the day, and had lost roughly a quarter of his army doing it. That is the pattern of the entire southern campaign. Greene lost nearly every battle he fought and won the campaign because each British victory cost men who could not be replaced 3,000 miles from home, while Greene's losses were replaced from a countryside that had turned decisively against the occupier. Cornwallis, his army worn down, and his southern strategy in ruins, made a decision that would end the war. He marched north into Virginia. In the summer of 1781, Cornwallis established a base at Yorktown on a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay, where the Royal Navy could supply and, if necessary, evacuate him. It was a sound decision that rested on one assumption, that the Royal Navy would control the sea. For most of a century, that assumption had been safe. What followed depended on a coordination of events so improbable that it is difficult to describe without it sounding like fiction. A French admiral, the Comte de Grasse, was operating in the Caribbean. He sent word north that he could bring his fleet, 28 ships of the line, to the Chesapeake, but only for a limited window before he had to return. Washington had spent years planning to attack New York. He abandoned the plan in days. He and the French commander Rochambeau marched their combined armies south from New York, moving more than 400 miles while maintaining an elaborate deception, building ovens, spreading false information to convince the British commander in New York that an attack on him was imminent. It worked for long enough. And on the 5th of September 1781, a British fleet arrived off the Chesapeake to find de Grasse already there. The Battle of the Chesapeake is the least famous decisive engagement in American history, and it decided everything. It was not spectacular. The two fleets manoeuvred and exchanged fire inconclusively for a couple of hours, and the British, damaged and unable to force the entrance, withdrew to New York to refit. That was all. No great destruction, no captured flagship. But when the British fleet sailed away, Cornwallis's escape route closed, and it did not reopen. By late September, he was surrounded. 16,000 American and French troops on the land side, a French fleet across the bay. He had about 8,000 men, The siege was conducted according to the formal European science of siegecraft, which Washington's engineers and the French officers understood thoroughly. Trenches were dug in parallel lines, each closer than the last. Artillery was brought forward. 2 forward positions were taken by assault in the night, one by French troops, one by American light infantry under a young colonel named Alexander Hamilton, who had begged for the command. There was no way out. A breakout attempt failed. An attempt to evacuate across the river was broken up by a storm. On the 19th of October, 1781, the British army at Yorktown marched out and laid down its weapons. Cornwallis did not appear, pleading illness. His second in command surrendered the sword. There is a persistent story that the British musicians played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down, which may or may not be true and has survived because it ought to be. Yorktown did not formally end the war. Britain still held New York, Charleston and Savannah, and still possessed the largest navy in the world. But when the news reached London in November, Lord North, who had been Prime Minister for 12 years and had wanted to resign for most of them, reportedly received it as though he had been struck and said repeatedly that it was all over. He was right, though what had ended was not Britain's capacity to fight. What had ended was Parliament's willingness to pay for it, because Britain was now at war with France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic simultaneously. Gibraltar was under siege. The Caribbean sugar islands were exposed. India was contested. And the 13 colonies, the least profitable of these, Hanfis, had just cost another entire army. North's government fell in March 1782. The new ministry opened negotiations. The talks in Paris took most of 2 years, and the American commissioners, Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, did something they had been explicitly instructed by Congress not to do. They negotiated separately with Britain rather than in concert with France. It was strictly a violation of the alliance. It was also shrewd, because French interests and American interests had diverged. France was content with an independent America that remained small and dependent. The Americans wanted the whole territory east of the Mississippi. They got it. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, recognized the United States as free and independent, with a western boundary at the Mississippi River, a territory far larger than the 13 colonies had ever administered. Franklin then had to explain the separate negotiation to the French foreign minister, and managed it so gracefully that France extended another loan shortly afterward. The treaty did not mention the native nations who lived in the territory being transferred and who had not been consulted, defeated, or included. For them, the peace of 1783 was not a conclusion, but the opening of a much longer and far worse chapter. Nor did the treaty resolve anything about slavery, which continued in every state that had it, and expanded westward into the new territory over the following decades, until the contradiction the founders had set aside in July 1776 was finally settled by a war that killed more Americans than every other American war combined. On the 25th of November 1783, the last British troops left New York. And a month later, in Annapolis, George Washington did the thing that his contemporaries found more astonishing than any battle he had fought. He resigned. He walked into Congress, handed back his commission, and went home to Virginia. It is difficult now to convey how strange this seemed. The 18th century's expectation was that a victorious general with a loyal army becomes the government. It was what Cromwell had done, what Caesar had done, what nearly everyone assumed would happen. There had been officers in his own army who suggested it to him, and he had shut them down with real anger. When George III was told that Washington intended to resign and return to farming, he is said to have replied that if he did so, he would be the greatest man in the world. Whether the king actually said it, we do not know. It is the kind of quotation that survives because it captures something people needed to be true. And that is the whole of it. 20 years, from a clerk copying a number in a London office to an army marching out of its lines in Virginia, while a fleet that arrived at exactly the right moment sat in the bay behind them. If you go looking for the moment it became inevitable, you will not find it. That is the honest answer, and historians have been giving it for 2 centuries. There is no single decision, no one villain, no afternoon on which the outcome became certain. There is only a long series of reasonable men making defensible choices in conditions they did not understand, separated by an ocean that took 4 months to cross and a set of assumptions that turned out not to survive contact with each other. The British were not tyrants. They were an overextended government trying to pay for a war it had won, applying to America a set of rules that seemed unremarkable at home. The Americans were not, for most of this story, revolutionaries. They spent the first 10 of these 20 years insisting they were loyal subjects, asking for rights they already believed they possessed, and the outcome turned again and again on things nobody planned. A letter left on a desk in London while a minister went to the country, a wind that held for one night on the East River, a fog that came in at the right hour, a fleet from the Caribbean arriving days before its British counterpart, a Prussian captain with an inflated resume who happened to be exactly what was needed. Underneath all of it sat the question we started with, the one that never quite got answered, and perhaps never can be. Who governs a place, really? The authority that holds the legal right? Or the people who have simply been doing it day after ordinary day for so long that the habit has become a fact? So as you drift off tonight, you might picture some of the smaller moments rather than the famous ones. A printer in Boston unfolding a notice and feeling a small unease he cannot yet name. 80 men standing on a village green before sunrise, uncertain what they mean to do. A bookseller dragging cannon across a frozen mountain because nobody had told him it was impossible. A Prussian officer swearing beautifully in a language his men did not understand, teaching them to turn from column into line. A boatman on the Delaware in the sleet, doing the one thing he happened to know how to do well. None of them knew they were inside history. They were cold or worried or simply doing the next thing in front of them. That is nearly always how it works. The ships are gone now. The roads are paved. The harbour where the tea went in is buried under the city that grew over it. The fields at Yorktown are quiet, and the bay where everything turned looks like any other stretch of water on a grey afternoon. But the argument they were having has never entirely ended, and somewhere tonight somebody is still making it, in a different language, about a different question. Let the candles go out. Let the ledgers close. Let the long, cold Delaware run quiet, and sleep well.